Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to this evening with Annelise Gray. I'm really thrilled that we're going to be talking today about Annelise's Circus Maximus books, and in particular we're celebrating the publication of the paperback of Rider of the Storm. We are aware that some of you attending the event this evening may not have read the first two books, and so we're going to take account of that in setting up the whole series for you before we move on to talk about Rider of the Storm. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Annelise to this event.
Hi there.
It's great to see you again. Do you know, I can't believe it. It was 2021 when we spoke, and I was thinking it was like maybe mid last year, but of course there's been a whole new book that has managed to squeeze itself in between these two. So when I spoke to you, the first Circus Maximus, Race to the Death, had just been published, and you are incredibly well qualified to write about this, having both a love of horses but also a background in Roman history, gaining a PhD in the women and writing about the women of the Roman Empire. So we can see all of these things colliding in your books. But I do want to say that first and foremost, you're an incredible writer of stories. So how have the past few years been? Let's just start there. You must have been so busy. You're still teaching.
I am. So I have a sort of day job as a teacher. I teach Latin, and I was a Latin teacher when I had the idea for the first Circus Maximus book. And the inspiration, as you talked about, was partly from my love of the Romans, which began when I was at school and I first started learning about Pompeii and was just kind of entranced with this sort of buried city that had sort of emerged, and all the extraordinary information about the Romans that we could get from it. So that remember being a sort of really formative educational moment for me. But then it goes also back to my love of horses. And as I say, I basically, when I was a kid, my favorite, I really was obsessed with horse and pony stories. I was lucky enough to ride myself as a child, and I loved horse and pony stories. And I was just one day watching television. This was about 2015, 2016. And I was watching a Formula One race. I've always loved sport all my life as well. And I was watching a Formula One race, and just the sort of cogs of my brain started to turn. And I thought, what if there was a character in a children's book who was a little bit like Velvet Brown, the lead character of my favorite book from childhood, who, for people who don't know, Velvet Brown wins a horse in a village raffle and becomes obsessed with racing this horse at the Grand National, the greatest, most famous horse race in the world. So I was watching this, and as I say, this character sort of came to me, this kind of Velvet Brown character, but her story was set in ancient Rome. And rather than being sort of Formula One cars going around a track, it was chariots. And this character sort of took hold of me, and she wouldn't let me go. And although I was really busy as a teacher, I decided she won't let me go. I have to try and write her story. So I spent probably 3 or 4 years kind of working away at this story, sometimes, really just doing a few hundred words in the space of a few months because things were so busy. But then, really just thinking I've got to make a go at this. So I kind of cut back on my teaching, and I finished the manuscript and to my amazement, found a home, found a publisher for it. And so that was the first Circus Maximus book. And that's Race to the Death. And that's when we spoke back in March 21. And at the time when I wrote Race to the Death, I wasn't visualizing a series. I was just, I just wanted to get this story that meant a lot to me out there. And I hadn't really thought beyond that. And when I went to meet my publisher, Zephyr, and my wonderful editor, Fiona Kennedy, my agent had said to me before I went in to meet her, you need an idea for a second book. I was like, okay, right, I'll think of something. And actually the idea that I went in with, Fiona said, that's great. But the idea I had was set some way a few years into the future. And she said, no, we're going to need to know what happens to Dido next, right away. And so I came up with the idea for the second book, Rivals on the Track, really just from a seed of an idea in the first book, which I didn't obviously at the time realized I'd planted for myself. And so then I spent the next year, and it was the pandemic. I basically started the pandemic writing book 2. And it was tough, but I got through it. And then they said, no, we want more. So now there is Rider of the Storm. Book 3 is out there, and I sort of can't, again, I never sort of visualize that happening, but it's been a very busy couple years, but kind of amazing.
We're going to talk about each of those books in turn, but I want to just explore a little bit more about Dido, your main character first, and her particular special relationship with this horse Porcellus, who's there throughout the series as well. So tell us a little bit more, first of all, about the character of Dido.
So Dido, the way I saw her is she's sort of a young horse whisperer, really. She's got an extraordinary intuitive gift for horses, and she's grown up surrounded by horses. So her father Antonius is the head trainer for one of the big chariot racing teams in ancient Rome. And she's grown up without her mother. She's never known her mother, Sophonisba, who was an acrobat rider at the Circus Maximus being the great racetrack in ancient Rome. And in between races, they would have these entertainments by these acrobat riders. But we learn very early on, it's not a spoiler to say that her mother is killed in an accident when she's very young. So she's just grown up with her dad. Her dad is the center of her world, and she's sort of, whether a Dido could exist in the ancient world in quite the way I've described her is a sort of open question, because her father, the idea of a girl being allowed to kind of ride as she does around the stables at the Circus Maximus, and her father, can see really her gift for horses and indulges it and lets her help out at the stables and lets her groom the horses. And in the first scene of Race to the Death, the first book, we see Dido meeting this horse who will be the love of her life, the equine love of her life. Mm-hmm. And you also see Dido's gift as a charioteer, because her dad's also taught her to drive chariots. And so in the first scene, she's racing a boy, she's challenged to a race, and the prize is this horse. And in true kind of horse and pony story tradition, this little black horse is one that nobody's been able to manage to this point. But Dido, with her gift, with her sensitivity, with her ability to talk to horses in a way, which is, as one of the other characters says, is able to communicate with this horse, and they form an unbreakable bond, which is a really core relationship throughout the books.
Tell us just a little bit about that unknown. You are allowed as a writer of fiction to delve into the unknown. We don't know whether a Dido could have existed, but you do know quite a lot about the women of Rome, and they are some pretty strong, powerful women who, even in political spheres, are pulling the strings. So there's a possibility, is there?
Well, the first, as you say, I certainly cut my teeth a little bit researching women of ancient Rome. So I feels like a lifetime ago now, but my first ever book, which I wrote about 12 years ago, which I actually wrote under a different name, because Gray is actually my middle name. It's actually not my real last name. So I wrote this book about the wives and mothers and daughters and sisters of the imperial family. So it was called The First Ladies of Rome. And that, of course, was about high status women for the most part. One of the joys of writing the Circus Maximus books is actually I'm mostly not writing about rich and wealthy people. I'm writing about real Romans. I'm writing about, people, charioteers and people working in that sphere who were very much more the ordinary people of Rome. And again, could there have been a Dido? Well, certainly, women were not allowed to be charioteers in ancient Rome, which is obviously a big part of Dido's is a frustration to Dido that she's not allowed to. And there's one piece when I go into talk in schools, there's one little piece of evidence that I read about when I was researching the books, which I find very intriguing, very moving, it was the discovery of some little sort of chariot, sort of race tokens, the kind of things that would have got you into the Circus Maximus. And they were found in the grave of a young Roman girl from the 4th century. And they've got, as I say, little images of horses on one side and charioteers on the other. Now, there's a certain amount of speculation has to go into what were these little tokens doing in this little girl's grave. But I very much liked the interpretation of the academic whose work I read it in, which was that maybe in part these tokens, this girl had gone to the chariot races with her family, and that these were sort of almost like ticket stubs from a football match or something. These were mementos of this girl's enjoyment of chariot racing. And the thing is, although we don't know of any girl charioteers, it's probably unlikely anyone ever did, a girl ever did race at the Circus Maximus. For me, it's almost illogical that there wouldn't have been girls, just a few of them even, in that huge crowd at the Circus Maximus, sort of getting a thrill of the idea of being a charioteer, as Dido does. And so that's that's a kind of image that I hold on to when I'm writing her story. And of course, as you say, the joy of fiction is you can write something that might be historically impossible, but maybe feels a little bit authentic.
I just want to ask you about horses before we move on and hear you read from the story, because you're also a keen horse rider yourself. Is Porcellus based on a horse that you have known?
That's a good question. I have to issue the caveat. I haven't sat on a horse in years, and horses, as I say, it was really my mother who kind of, I'm not going to say she indoctrinated, but she kind of almost insisted that my brother and I, that horses were going to be part of our life as much as possible. She never had horses as a child herself. But I grew up in Bermuda. You might hear an accent. And so I grew up in Bermuda. My father was Bermudian, my mother's British. And there was a riding stable near our house. And so we used to go and ride horses. And that's kind of where I got the bug. And then when we moved to the UK, as I say, we were very lucky enough to have horses of our own. And I mean, when I think about, as I say, the sort of few kind of horses that there were in my life as a kid, because I stopped riding when I was about 15, I would not have coped with a Porcellus, to be honest with you, because I was a very nervous rider. And I like going slowly. Dido, in a way, is a sort of, I get to live vicariously through her, because I wouldn't dare to do what she does. And the idea of a horse like Porcellus, who's incredibly, difficult and fearsome, that would have terrified me. So he's not really based on any horse that I know, other than, I suppose, maybe in a fictionalized way. Some people watching might be very familiar with Walter Farley's story, The Black Stallion. And The Black Stallion, the film of it, was pretty much my favorite film when I was a child. So there's definitely an element of the horse and the black stallion in Porcellus.
Of course, I know we're going to come to this later, but you revisit that a little bit in Rider of the Storm. So there's obviously something in you about taming the wild horse.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Shall we hear a bit of the story? Would you like to set that up for us?
I would love to. So I'm going to read a little bit from Race to the Death. And this is quite early on in the book. And so what's going on here is that Dido, as I say, has been running around the stables, helping get some of the horses ready. And she's made a friend, this young man called Justice, whose uncle is the wealthy owner of the faction. So they're from different walks of life, but they've made friends. And they're in the Circus Maximus itself. They're watching a race. Dido's favorite driver, Fabius, is leading this race. But the Greens, her dad's faction, have got sort of runners in the race, and there's a driver called Fuscus who Dido doesn't think much of, but he's in the race as well. And essentially, this is near the climax of the race. And some of what I read from this, we'll talk a little bit more about the research that went into it later. So I will begin. The sixth dolphin dropped its nose. There was one more lap to go. Darius glanced behind him again and relaxed his hands on the reins, clearly content to settle for second place. I looked back down the field to see what was happening. Fuscus has got a chance of third. Come on, Fuscus. No, don't attack him on the bend. You'll never have the pace. Wait until you're in the straight again. But to my amazement, Nessus and his grey companions nipped past the red chariot with room to spare. They tore toward the finish, and now it was the turn of every Green supporter in the stadium to cheer. He's going to do it! He's going to do it! He's done it! I started jumping up and down, even before Fuscus had crossed the line. Nessus, you beauty! That's a second and a third place. Papa's going to be so pleased. I paused, mid-celebration, noticing that the grey coats of Nessus and his team were dappled with foam. Despite crossing the finish line, they hadn't slowed. In fact, they were going faster, their galloping legs flailing like a tangle of spiders. Spittle sprayed from their mouths, and their eyes bulged from their heads. They flew past Fabius, who was cantering on his victory lap, and still they kept going. Pull them up. Why doesn't he pull them up? Asked Justice. I don't think he can, I said. Something's wrong. Fuscus was leaning back against the reins now, trying to use the weight of his whole body to slow his team. Someone behind us shouted a warning, and I saw the uncleared debris on the track from an earlier collision. Too late. Fuscus saw it too. His chariot bounced, and with an eruption of splintering wood, the axle disintegrated under his feet. Trapped by the long reins wound around his waist, he jerked forward and was dragged along the floor of the circus. Some of the crowd started to cheer, but their taunts were smothered by the green supporters yelling urgently. "Get your knife, Fuscus," I shouted. "Cut the reins." I could see him grabbing wildly for his knife in the pocket of his leather corselet. They practiced for this, of course. I'd seen Antonius demonstrate the technique to the drivers. "Grab the knife, as if you're going to stab someone," he would say. "Then slice. Don't change your grip and be quick. Your life might depend on it." But Nessus and the other Greys were hurtling so fast, terrified at the strange burden, chasing them along the sand. And Fuscus couldn't free the dagger from beneath his twisting body. One of his leg protectors was torn off, leaving his skin exposed. I closed my eyes. When I was little, I had seen the body of a charioteer who had died like this, strips of skin peeling from his raw flesh, his body like a broken doll. The image had given me nightmares ever since. Somewhere nearby, someone was laughing, a wail of enjoyment that made me shiver. I opened my eyes and saw my father climbing out of the pit onto the track. Somehow, he leapt on Nessus's back as the Greys tried to dodge him. Reaching with both hands, he grabbed the reins, either side of the bit, and eventually dragged the whole team to a skidding halt. Stewards ran towards Fuscus with a stretcher. The shouting of the crowd subsided, and I unclenched my fists. I could hear Justice exhaling. "He's all right. He's all right. He's moving his head." I thought he was a dead man for certain, but I wasn't looking at Fuscus. I'd suddenly realized where the laughter was coming from. Caligula was on his feet, doubled over, and shaking with enjoyment, seemingly oblivious to the puzzled stares from the spectators around him.
So much to pick up from that. And I think one of the things that's really obvious to anybody listening is that it does feel very authentic, well researched. You've got the reins wrapped around the waist. You know where the knife is inside the breast pocket, ready to cut free. But it wears the research very lightly, because what's carrying you along in that episode is the excitement of the moment. And here we have the Circus Maximus. I was actually there in the summer in 40-degree.
Oh my goodness, that's too hot.
It was unbearable. Did they sit there in the summer? It must have been. Were they covered?
No, I mean, so unlike at the Colosseum, which obviously is later than the period of Circus Maximus books, and the Colosseum did have some sort of covering. No, they don't seem to have had any at the Circus Maximus, from what I can gather. So it must be sweltering. Something I've actually always meant to research, I'd always be curious in, is what did the Romans do for sunburn? I sort of occurred to me the other day that I have no idea. So there must be something on it somewhere. I was there myself actually earlier in the year as well. I went with a group of the children that I teach, and we sat at the far end, and it was the first time I'd been there since I started writing the books. You know, I'd been there a couple of times, you know, in previous years. But so we sat at the far end, and of course I made one of the kids take lots of photos of me with the book so I could, you know, put them on social media. And then I read them a little bit from Rider of the Storm, which had just come out, and that was really, really cool, really fun thing to do.
Tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here. It is Circus Maximus, but how is it organised? I think I can see where the racing. What's that strip down the middle?
Yeah, so it's a little bit hard to see. I mean, the Circus Maximus now is used basically as a public park. You can see a lot of people there having picnics. They do have concerts there sometime. I gather my favorite musician Bruce Springsteen did a concert there recently, which would have been amazing to go to. And I think I read somewhere that they were actually going to sort of stage another chariot race there or something as a kind of reenactment. But I mean, what you see there is really just a footprint, and you can sort of see, as I say, if we in a way, we'll see the sort of a next slide in a minute, which actually I think gives you a better sort of reconstructed idea what it looked like. But the buildings you can see in the background, that's the remains of the palace, of the imperial palace where the Roman emperors lived. And amazingly, it seems to have had kind of direct access to the circus, that they could actually get straight to the sort of VIP viewing box that the Roman emperor and his family would sit in. Although, and the Circus Maximus is much older than the age of emperors. It had existed for centuries before the Roman emperors came along. But over time, it was sort of, I think it would have started out quite basic, you know, not much in the way of seating, and then as time goes on, people sort of make improvements to it. There's more and more seating around the edges. And actually, is it possible to go to the next
Yes,
slide? Because then
I will
this
take my cue from you.
take your cue. So there are many reconstructions like this out there, but this kind of gives you an idea maybe of what the circus would have been like. And if I just sort of point out, as I say, you can see on the sort of top edge there's the imperial palace that you could see the remains of a while ago. But sort of the key features really are to the sort of bottom left is where the starting gates were. So that's where the chariots and their horses would sort of burst out. And I saw a really good documentary a few years ago about them kind of trying to reconstruct the starting mechanism by which the gates would sort of spring open. And it seems that they really did, kind of spring open with a bang. And there would be, you could fit as many as 12 chariots. And if you consider that most chariot races involved 4-horse teams, that was really the test of the best charioteers is how well could you handle a 4-horse team. So they would sort of burst out of those 12 gates, and you can see, I don't know if you can just make it out, that there's these sort of lines marked, and those were starting lanes, and you were supposed to keep to your lane at the start, and then you would race sort of anti-clockwise around that long thin bit in the middle, which is, I call it the channel in the books, which is the translation of a term that they did use at one point in history. And because I was very keen in the books, as you said earlier, I was very keen not to make it feel like you're having a history lesson with these books, and I didn't want to use really any Latin terms at all. I know there's some Roman historical fiction that does that. I just, that didn't feel right to me. So I call it the channel, but it might also have been called the spina or the spine. And that was sort of the thing that they raced around, and they would do 7 laps of the track. And I think it's estimated that each race probably would have taken about 12 to 15 minutes. And there were also, and people who've seen the film Ben-Hur will be familiar with this, because of course they didn't have, big screens or, announcers who could tell everybody how many laps had gone or how many there were left to go. So they had these different kind of lap counter systems. And at the time when Dido's racing, they have these dolphins, these sort of 7 gold or gilded dolphins, which would sort of be sort of positioned with their noses. I mean, I think there's a little bit of uncertainty exactly how they worked, but essentially they would kind of flip up and their tails would go up and their noses would go down when one lap had been completed. So, but I mean, the thing that I always try to get across, the main thing that you have to get about the Circus Maximus is how unspeakably huge it is. So I often go to schools and I will say to the kids, okay, so what's the biggest capacity sporting ground in the world? And they'll come up with their answers, and nobody ever gets close. And the biggest one is, I think it's a cricket ground in India, which is about 120,000 people could fit in there. And the Circus Maximus estimates suggest that it could fit as many as 250,000 people. And I think people often think of gladiator fighting as being the sport that the Romans kind of loved the most, but actually gladiator fighting was nothing compared to chariot racing. Chariot racing was the football of the ancient world. It was the sport, the people's sport, and it inspired passions, and deadly rivalries that sort of might seem a little bit familiar today. So
the factions, like
yes,
football teams, we have the greens, the whites, the reds, and the blues.
Indeed.
And, Emperor Caligula, who, as I said before, was a gift to you from history. You've certainly made him as mean as his meanest depiction.
Yeah. So when I was starting the first book, Race to the Death, I did quite a lot of preliminary research because, as I say, although I'm a classicist by training, I didn't know much about chariot racing at all, other than what I gleaned to teach a little bit in lessons at school. So I did a fair bit of research. I have this sort of big thick tranche of research notes that I still are kind of my Bible when I'm writing the books. And it was really when I was sort of finding an antagonist for Dido, Caligula, the Emperor Caligula, the third Roman emperor, really, as you say, was a gift. And as I say, I decided to set Dido's stories to have them overlap with his reign, because the thing that if anyone knows anything about Caligula, it tends to be this story, which is that he so was passionate about chariot racing, he was passionate about horses, and he had this favorite racehorse that he adored, and he is said to have made this horse consul, which is kind of the highest political rank in the Roman political tree below emperor. And it's, to be honest, and there's various people who've kind of suggested that maybe actually what he was doing was mocking his senators and saying, you guys are also useless, I might as well make my horse consul. But that little snippet was something that I built a big plot strand around in the books, which I shouldn't give away. But just details like that, and details about his obsession, the fact that he was said to have gone and dined with the Green faction, his favorite team's charioteers, at their stables, that this racehorse that he loved so much in Citatus, he gave it its own marble stable, and it had to have a gold feeding bowl. And if people made, if the crowd who were queuing outside the Circus Maximus made too much noise and it might disturb his horse's sleep, he would have them, moved on or beaten. So really stories that, you could discuss from an academic point of view about whether they are, perfect representations of what Caligula was like. That didn't matter to me. I was just like, that's gold. He's my villain. And we're running with that. So yeah, he plays a big part in the overarching narrative of the three books.
Let's have a look at the last few slides that you've got to talk to us about here. So
mosaic. This is a mosaic from North Africa, from Tunisia, and a lot of the narrative action of the books is actually partially set in Rome, but it is also set in North Africa, which was of course a province of Rome at this time. And again, what's really interesting, part of the reason that I did that was because when I was doing the research, I found that a lot of the best horses and the most prized charioteers were trained in North Africa. That was seen as one of the best places for horses. So this mosaic is from there. And what it really shows you is a charioteer from each of the four factions. So there were four factions or racing teams in ancient Rome: the greens, the blues, the reds, and the whites. And the evidence suggests that the blues and the greens were the big two. And the greens in particular were sort of the people's team, if you like. They were kind of the kind of, the team of regular people, of regular Romans. And as I say, Caligula was said to have been a big fan of theirs. And that might plant the seed a bit in your head as to, well, was he a fan because he genuinely loved them, or did he think this is politically cunning of me to actually be seen to support the Greens? But you also see things like what the charioteers wear. You see that I don't know if you can tell, but they've got these they're kind of wearing what looks like sort of wrappings or leggings on their legs. And that I often, when I go into schools, I say to the kids, well, why do you think they've got those on their legs? They're standing in a chariot. Why do they need to have their legs covered? And the point, of course, is to get them thinking about, well, what happens when you have an accident? And this is an incredibly dangerous sport. There are what they call shipwrecks. So that's basically where one chariot deliberately smashes into another. There's danger all over the place. And obviously, if you are on the back of a chariot and you are dragged, and I can talk about that a bit more with the next slide, as Dido kind of talks about a little bit in that bit I read, your skin's going to get ripped off you. So you need to have this sort of protection on your legs. And they also carried a knife, which, as I say, was basically to cut themselves free if they were dragged by the reins wrapped around their waist. So
just while you're talking there, you mentioned talks that you give in school. I just want to make it clear to the audience that are listening that we've chosen some slides to show them today, but actually when you do go into school to do events, you've got a much more extensive portfolio. Yeah. We decided not to give everybody everything this evening.
This is just a flavor. This is just a little flavor. And this one, what people often don't notice, that this is obviously an image of a kind of almost a snapshot of a race in action. And people often don't notice the sort of bottom right corner that there's sort of someone on the ground there. And there's different interpretations of what they might be doing. But essentially you can see that they are in imminent danger of being trampled. And as I say, this was an incredibly dangerous sport. I also wanted, as I say, it's really important in the books that the horses are important characters just as much as the humans. You certainly don't have to be a horsey person, I hope, to enjoy them, but the horses are characters in their own right. And it's the horse on the sort of left of the team, the one that's closest to the turning post. The turning post is the most dangerous part of the race, because obviously that's where you've got to make a very sharp turn and not give ground to people coming up on your outside, but also not get smashed against the turning post and the channel on your inside. And it was that inside horse in particular who it seems that was sort of the one that the crowd would shout their name. And that was, you know, almost the horse that had to be the best trained, because they had to sort of lead the team around that very, very sharp bend. And there's evidence of cheating galore. Again, that was some of the most fun research, was the sort of suggestions of people nobbling other people's horses, either by poison or, you know, sort of trying to use magic to curse another team. So all of that stuff gives me little droplets of color that I can add into the narrative.
Not so different from what some people do today. Nice behavior.
Absolutely. I had this when I was writing Race to the Death. I had this fantastic correspondence, because I don't want to kind of give away spoilers, but the idea of cheating and potentially nobbling other people's horses, as I say, kind of to influence the outcome of races, is a theme in Race to the Death. And I had this fantastic correspondence with a German forensic specialist who was he's a sort of chemist by training, but he had a side interest in the history of doping in sport throughout history. And he was incredibly helpful. And I thanked him in the back of the book, because he gave me some useful ideas for how I could sort of plausibly and not, you know, medically possibly influence the outcome of races.
Just before we leave this relief that you've got here, you've talked about the horse on the inside next to the channel. I mean, I'm fascinated by this arrangement of 4 horses. And do the others have particular roles? I mean, the horse on the outside, does that have to have special qualities as well?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely, and I very much there's some, you know, wonderful experts on the history of horses in the ancient world. Another someone else who helped me very much was apologist. It's a brilliant job title, called Carolyn Willikis, an American academic, and she gave me some help actually, particularly on book 3. But it seems that yes, they did all have slightly different jobs to do, and so that the 2 horses that are in the middle, which I've called the yoke horses in the book, because they're the ones actually under the yoke, the sort of long draft pole that it connects the chariot to the harness, that they would have to be sort of kind of quite steady, be able to work together as a pair, because they're the ones actually pulling the chariot. And then the house on the outside would probably have to be powerful enough to kind of hold off horses that might be coming in and trying to overtake and trying to force you over, but be able to sort of keep up pace, because they've actually the ones who've got to kind of go the furthest around, so they've got to have lots of stamina. Some of it I kind of slightly intuited. I sort of thought about what makes sense. One of the best compliments I've got from someone is that they were really puzzled. They sort of have you race chariots yourself? And I said, no, if I could get my hands on one and someone would let me, I'd be delighted. But no, I've never done it. And they were kind of, I almost think they didn't believe me, because they sort of thought that, but how have you managed to kind of convey what it might be like to drive one? So that was, you know, a really, really nice compliment.
There you are, the magic of the writer. You can do anything that you want.
I try my best. And that is the man. That is the man himself. That is a sort of side by side. There's a sort of portrait bust of Caligula on the right, and then someone's done I'm not sure if it comes out the same way for you, but you can see which one is the ancient version and which one is the modern reconstruction of Caligula. And I'm sure a lot of people know, so he's the 3rd Roman emperor. He has he's come along after Augustus, the first emperor who rules Rome for a long time, and then Tiberius, who's a sort of less successful, slightly dour type. And then Caligula comes along, and he's known as one of the mad bad emperors of Roman history. And there's a lot of detail about him that I couldn't possibly include in a children's book, that would be very shocking, I think, to younger readers. So I had to be careful with that. But he is, you know, he's a monster, really, if you go along the sort of portrait of him in the ancient sources. And actually, one of the interesting things about writing the most recent book, Rider of the Storm, was kind of trying to explore a little more the idea of what makes Caligula what he is, because I'm never sort of, I like it if you're going to have a baddie. I sort of like it if you explore a little bit what made them that way, and it's not a kind of just a completely, well, they were just fully formed that way as evil. I think it's more interesting to kind of suggest what might be the path to that. I enjoy a baddie who gets redeemed a little bit as well, but you'll have to read the book to see whether I extend the same courtesy to Caligula. But he was very interesting to kind of to create. And of course, my Caligula is not exactly a historical Caligula, but he is certainly one inspired by ancient evidence.
It is chilling when you get the reconstruction and you see the eyes. It's the eyes in particular.
Yeah.
You suddenly think, oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're back to the 3 book jackets here, because I'm aware that we do want to talk a little bit about Rivals on the Track, but more especially Rider of the Storm. But I feel you need to create a bridge for us from the first book to the third. So what do you think we need to know about book 2 without giving too much away?
Yes, it's difficult because there's a lot of mystery in the books as well. There's a lot of secrets that emerge in book 2 that you probably don't see so much of in book 1. So in book 1, really, Dido quite early on experiences a tragic act of betrayal, which turns her whole life upside down. And a lot of the narrative of book 1 is about her partly trying to make her dream come true, which is ultimately to get to race the Circus Maximus herself. But she's also dealing with the fact that there are Roman soldiers hunting her down. She has got people on her trail trying to find her and trying to kill her. So that sort of danger and jeopardy is very much part of the narrative. Book 2, she is still in hiding. She is still on the run, still trying to protect herself and Porcellus. But book 2, I think we learn more about Dido's past and her family's past. And part of the story of book 2 is about, as I say, she learns a big secret about her family, about her past that's been kept hidden from her. And part of what she's trying to do in book 2 is really kind of lay some old ghosts to rest and put her family back together a little bit. And so, and there's a lot more. I had to, it's funny when you've written one set of chariot races in book 1, you think, how am I going to top that? How am I going to keep the reader, keep it fresh? And so I kind of created some slightly original chariot racing action in this one as well. But as I say, I do like the emotional heart and the sort of character relationships in book 2 very much as well, but with all the danger as well. And then
Porcellus races in book 2.
Oh yeah, and there's a new horse. That's
stadium.
Yes. So the action of book 2 is really set in North Africa, because that is where sort of Dido is based for part of the time. And I did some fictionalization in book 2. So there is a circus in book 2, which is not based on historical reality, but I created for the purpose of the story. But I think that the other main thing about book 2 is there's another horse. Porcellus is very much still a part of that. But Dido rescues actually another horse who I love, the horse called Jewel. And Jewel I love Jewel. And she's interesting. She's a mare, so she's a girl horse. And the Romans actually, a bit like with female charioteers, they certainly didn't believe a girl could be a charioteer. The Romans also didn't believe that mares made very good racehorses. And in the record, you can see that most of the horses that we have the names of hundreds of horses who race at the Circus Maximus, but they don't have many mares. And so Jewel is a horse that slightly confounds expectations. And she's got a really good she's got a really kind of cool personality as a horse, and she makes a good pair with Porcellus in book 2.
We're going to introduce Rider of the Storm, and the book jacket's a great way in, because I think this is basically from the opening scene. I mean, the storm is brewing, and that brings yet another new horse into the story, Ghost, who has sort of echoes of Porcellus about him, another difficult horse. Just set the story up for us a little bit.
Yes. So Rider of the Storm, again, it starts really with Dido asking. Again, I sort of don't want to give too much away, but she's asking a lot of questions about. She's a little older than she was in the first 2 books, and she's really at a bit of a crossroads, and she's sort of figuring out, who am I and what do I want to be, and so on. A lot of questions that young people ask themselves growing up. And as you say, in the very very early on, she encounters a horse who, in many respects, is rather like Porcellus. But shockingly for Dido, as I say, who's always been someone who thinks that there's no horse that she can't befriend, she meets this horse that rejects her attempts at love and affection, and that's very unsettling for her. But the jacket, as I say, in a departure, because the first 2 books show you obviously chariot racing scenes, And in this book, we see Dido on horseback, and that's a little bit of a departure. And there's lots more chariot racing still, but we see Dido trying a different skill, because as I mentioned, her mother was an acrobat rider at the Circus Maximus, and what we're going to see here is a character from her mother's past showing up, and his arrival, his appearance, is going to spark a bit of a crisis for Dido as she thinks about the possibility of maybe there's a different way for her to go back to the Circus Maximus. Maybe she could emulate her mother. Maybe she could emulate her mother and go back as an acrobat rider. Mm-hmm. So the scene that I'm going to read.
Can I just stop you for one moment, Annelise? Can we have the reading in a moment?
Oh, of course. Sorry.
And we'll come back to that, because we'll finish all the reading and leave everybody with this wonderful experience. But I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the craft of writing, because when I read your stories, I've already said that I'm really gripped by them. And this time I was reading in quite a, that conscious way when you're thinking about what it is you do as a reader. And I was very aware of seeing the scenes, the chariot race or the storm in this case, almost like a series of images, connected images, not quite a film for me. It might be for other people, but for me it was like connected images running alongside each other. And the narrative voice was very strong in my head, because I've heard you read before. Strangely, well, maybe not strangely, it was your voice reading the story to me. Sometimes it's your own voice, sometimes it's somebody else's voice. And it was just really interesting how all those things came together. And it started me thinking, well, I wonder what connection that has with writing. Does writing happen in a similar way? I know it will be different for different writers, just as it is for different readers. But I wanted to ask you more at that point about what's going on in your head.
Oh, it's a great question, and it's funny you describe it as being kind of like a filmic narrative, because I've sort of always assumed that it's like this for all writers. I don't know if it is, but I do see it like a film in my head, and I do think of myself almost as a director, and I'm standing next to Dido, I'm standing next to my characters, but I'm always thinking, where shall I point the camera next? Where shall I say cut? I think the way you end a chapter, I think is really important. You want to leave someone, wondering what's going to happen next. Sometimes I will be on social media and I will see someone writing about how they've written, 12,000 words in a week or something. And I'm just baffled, because for me, writing comes much slower. It is for me almost a more, I don't want to say tortured, because that makes it sound awful. It's not, but it's pretty slow for me. And I've sometimes wondered if, because I'm trying to write myself back into the past and into a world that is a bit murky, that is kind of unfamiliar, no matter, the fact that I've studied it doesn't mean that I find it a particularly familiar landscape. And so it's very much it's a slow kind of exploratory process for me. I've sometimes wondered, I don't know whether Philip Pullman intended this or he's ever talked about it, but sometimes when I'm trying to explain to people kind of what it's like writing, that image of Will, and I think he's called Will, isn't he, in The Subtle Knife, and how he's feeling his way into different worlds. He's sort of, using the tip of the knife to kind of feel his way in, and then he looks what's behind and decides, shall I go in there? And if not, then he kind of seals it. But that thing of trying to kind of almost like pick a lock into a different world, that's kind of what it feels like for me. And I'm quite a perfectionist in my drafts, as my editor will tell you. And my first draft is a bomb site, really, but because I'm just trying to, as you should, you're just trying to get things down, but I'm always again trying to feel my way into the characters, find the heartbeat of the characters, and that takes a little time. And I'm not very good at sort of moving on until I've found that. And I would like to make it easier for myself, but I can't quite seem to be able to yet. One day I'll figure it out. And I don't look at the best advice that anyone's ever given me when it comes to writing historical fiction. And this will sound blasphemous to some people, but it's that you write the story first and you do the research afterwards. Now, obviously, I did do some research because I had to figure out, what chariot racing was like. But with each book, I don't tend to do a lot of research at the start beyond that initial tranche that I did for Race to the Death, the story is really what matters, and the characters are what matters. And afterwards you can layer in the little bits of color and the detail and the smells and the taste and the sounds that hopefully make you feel like you're there. But for me, it's all about finding, what's the story really about? Essentially, what is this about? And that is a slow process for me.
What about that idea of hearing a voice? I can hear a voice reading it to me. It's a strange thing. It's in that auditory imagination there somewhere. It's not silent. What do you hear? You kind of talked about the filmic aspect of it. What about the words and how they sound as you're writing?
I don't think I hear them so much. Actually, something I didn't do with the first book, and I have done with book 2 and 3, and I wish I'd done it with the first book, is right at the end, I will read it aloud, because then, of course, you hear things in the cadence and things where, oh, that word, that's not right. And so that's very helpful. For me, actually, something that really helps is music. And often with a scene, I'm often putting a bit of music to it in my head. I have actually a playlist, I think, on Spotify, the Circus Maximus playlist, which is a sort of sample of songs that have often been helpful to me in figuring out what's the mood of this scene, or what's the relationship between these characters. Strangely, for this one, for Rider of the Storm, there's a key character in the books called Scorpus. And Scorpus is sort of, again, I don't want to give too much away, but Scorpus is sort of Dido's mentor. For those of you who've seen the Black Stallion, he's the Mickey Rooney character, if you like. And so he's very pivotal. And he has a son called Abibal, and their relationship is important to Dido. And their relationship is quite tortured in this book. And there's a song by Sam Fender called Spit of You. And there's a brilliant music video that goes with it, if anyone's seen it. And it's got the brilliant, amazing Stephen Graham playing Sam Fender's dad. And I know that sounds weird, but listening to that song, watching that video, hearing those lyrics was really important in sort of unlocking what's going on here. What's the heart, what's the kind of the tension in what's going on between these two. And there's lots of things in the books that I could put a piece of music to and tell you what they're.
Can people access your playlist?
I think so. Yeah. And I'll actually, when the paperback, so Rider of the Storm, as I say, is out in paperback next week. And so I'm going to post an updated Circus Maximus playlist so that everyone can, and I'll do a sort of post on my website about how the different songs have helped me create certain aspects of the story.
Mm-hmm. I'll remind everybody that you can visit Annelise's website, and that there are some excellent teacher's notes for Rider of the Storm and for the other 2 books as well. Can they access those via your website too?
On my website, there's a tab called Events and Resources, which is where I put everything about events I do, but also these amazing teacher resources by Claire Zinkin that go with Race to Death, and they go with Return, and they go with Rider of the Storm. So, and they are fantastic.
And people can visit their teachers' librarians if they're interested in booking you for.
There's a link. There's links for everything on Events and Resources on my website, which is annelisegray.co.uk.
Okay. We don't have any questions, but as I said to you, that usually means that people are just enjoying listening. So for everybody that has joined us this evening, I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank Annelise for giving her time this evening to talk to us about this fabulous series. We're going to read out the event, and when Annelise finishes reading, that will be the end of this evening's event. So thank you so much to everybody for coming along today. Over to you, Annelise.
Thank you. So, as I say, this is quite near the beginning of Rider of the Storm. And what we have here is Dido is sitting in the circus, the racetrack near Utica, which is where she's living. And she's with Scorpus, who I mentioned earlier, and also Atticus, who is an old family friend, shall we say. And they are, we see these trick riders, these acrobat riders who come out onto the track. And this sets up a little mystery that will be a key element of the story. A group of trick riders had emerged onto the track to entertain the crowd before the second race, dressed in colorful costumes and mounted on sturdy ponies with ribbons and jewels threaded through their manes. They galloped up and down, dismounting and remounting with theatrical flair. "Can't stand this kind of thing," grunted Atticus. "No real horsemanship, just a load of silly acrobatics." Then, realizing what he had said might upset us, he hastily added, "No insult to your sister Scorpus or your mother Dido, may her spirit rest. Sophonisba was a talented horsewoman. Don't worry, I said to Atticus, seeing that Scorpus's thoughts were somewhere else. We're not offended. The things she could do. Standing on 2 horses at once, jumping them through hoops of fire. He stopped, remembering, too late, that my mother had died doing such a trick. Awkwardly, he glanced at Scorpus. I'm sorry, Scorpus. About Abibel. Maybe I shouldn't have talked you into letting him go to Rome. No, Scorpus sighed. It's my fault. I protected him too much, and he resented it. I was afraid of losing him, if I had the chance. I tried to explain that better to him. Well, come to Rome and do it. Atticus clapped him on the back. I've told you, any number of times, we can put you up at the Blues Clubhouse. It'll be like old times. We'll go out on the town, 2 veterans of the track, relive the glory days. I will come. Soon. But there's a lot to do at the stables, and we're short-handed now that both boys have left home. How's Hanno? Doing well, as far as I know. Ismene writes me sometimes. He's staying with her and my brother while he does his apprenticeship. There's a good chariot builder near Tugga where he's learning the tricks of the trade. You expecting him home for a visit soon? Scorpus didn't answer. He was staring at the track. His face looked as if a cold wind had turned it to marble. Scorpus, I said. What's wrong? Instead of answering, he spoke urgently to Atticus. I can't seem to trust my eyes these days, he muttered. Tell me, is that who I think it is? Atticus squinted. I realized they were looking at one of the entertainers, a slender man with messy dark hair under a faded green cap. He was riding a grey horse whose great age you could tell by the thick speckling of white around his eyes and the dip in his spine. Even so, the horse moved smoothly, and the man himself, although he must have been the same age as Scorpus, leapt on and off its back lightly, as if he had wings on his ankles. Holy Jupiter! It is, you know, said Atticus. Who'd have thought it? And the grey, Scorpus! Look at the grey. What are you 2 talking about? I asked. Atticus and Scorpus looked at each other. Nothing, Dido, said Atticus. Someone Scorpus and I used to know, that's all. The trick riders were galloping side by side in pairs now. With amazing skill they swapped horses, without a foot touching the ground. The spectators applauded. I looked at the grey horse as he passed, and in the same moment the horse looked at me. His ears came forward, and he stopped, so suddenly that the startled acrobat slid off his back. As the crowd laughed, the riderless grey trotted up to the side of the track where I was sitting and stood right in front of me. There was a brightness in the cloudy depths of his eyes. I stared back, bewildered. Then, to my amazement, the old horse took a step back and slowly sank on his bent front knee. The people around us clapped. The man in the green cap came running after his horse. Forgive me, forgive me. He had a gap-toothed smile. Phoenix always has an eye for a pretty lady. His face changed as he studied me more closely. Then he noticed Scorpus and Atticus. I thought he seemed afraid. Up, Phoenix. Up, my old friend. He tapped the horse on the shoulder and led him away without looking back.